Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I'm Pat Speth, author of the Nickel Quilt books. I love to use 5-inch squares of fabrics in the quilts that I make, and I love scrappy quilts. The block that I'm going to demo for you today comes from my Dawn to Dusk quilt, and I used 5-inch squares of stash fabrics to make my quilt, but this quilt would also be great using charm packs. And we can make this quilt using 2.5-inch strips, and I will be demoing both of those methods for you today. Let's go ahead and take a closer look at this quilt. The batiks I used in my quilt reminded me of the colors in the sky at sunrise or sunset, and hence the name Dawn to Dusk. This quilt would look great in many fabric styles and would be perfect for using charm packs. I would recommend using 2 identical charm packs together so that all your darks within one block can be the same fabric. Complete instructions for making this quilt in 3 different sizes are included in the books More Nickel Quilts and the Big Book of Nickel Quilts. Ordering information will be at the end of this video. The 3 sizes are lap, twin, and queen. First, I'm going to demo for you how to make this block using 5-inch squares, and then immediately following that will be the demo on how to make this block using 2.5-inch strips. When making this block from 5-inch squares, it does require 2 light squares that are identical, 2 dark squares that are identical, and I normally refer to these as pairs. So a pair of the lights and a pair of the darks. I take those squares and I turn them into sets. Set A, set B. Each set has a light square, a dark square, and a light square and a dark square over in set B also. Set A, I measure up 2.5 inches and make a cut. This piece here, I set that aside for later. This piece, these pieces, I guess I should say, because I have set the dark and the light one on top of the other, cutting them both at once. This piece that is 2.5 inches by 5 inches gets set aside, and that's going to be used in the border. The other piece that was left, measuring over 4.5 inches, trimming that little bit away, and I always measure the full 4.5 inches rather than measuring 1/2 inch in. I measure over the full 4.5 inches. That way I know for sure my unit is the correct size. This needs to be 2.5 inches this way, 4.5 inches this way. Now that's all that we need to do right at this moment for set A. For set B, I have separated out the fabrics, working with just the light square for a moment, and on the wrong side of that light square, marking at the 2.5 inch marks. So measuring over, marking on the edge, each edge 2.5 inches, and the other direction, opposite direction, measuring 2.5 inches and putting a mark on both edges there. Next, connecting the dots. And my very favorite marking tool in the whole wide world is just a number 2 mechanical pencil. So draw a line. 3 lines is all we are drawing, connecting the dots. The next step, sewing to the outside of those lines. Rather than sewing directly on those lines, I like to sew just 1 thread away, just to the outside of the line, towards the corner we're going to be cutting away. Next step, now we get to do our cutting. I've already done it here, and what we do is we measure in one direction and cut it 2.5 inches, measure the other direction and cut it 2.5 inches. Now, I do like to utilize my waist triangle units, but before I stitch for my waist triangle units, I test these, the fold backs, the triangles, to make sure that they're going to align nicely. You know, I really try to master that sewing on one side of that line, but that doesn't always happen. But I always like to make sure I test these first before I stitch for my waist triangles. I like to stitch about 1/2 inch away from my original. There's my original sewing line here, about 1/2 inch away, in order to utilize my waist triangles, remembering that I'm leaving seam allowance for 2 units. Once I've stitched for my waist triangles, I can go ahead and cut those away, and I set the seam, and I usually press to the dark on this unit. You will have then a total of 3 of the half square triangle units, and that's all the components you need for the block. We have from set A the 2.5 inch by 4.5 inch rectangles in light and in dark, and then from set B we created 3 half square triangle units, and we still had left over a light square and a dark square. That's 2.5 inches square, those each. Sewing these together in rows in this format, in this arrangement here. When I do have the components in each row sewn together, I go ahead and I like to press away from the half square triangle unit. So in the top row, I'm pressing towards the rectangle. This row here, I'm pressing towards the squares, and in the last row, I press towards the rectangle. The rows then are ready to be joined to complete the block. The block, and this is note to myself, remember to tell them the unfinished size and the finished size. So right now, the block is going to measure 6.5 inches square, and it'll finish at 6 inches. For the pressing, the last pressing I do is press away from the center portion. That's all there is to making the block using 5-inch squares. Okay, so that was pretty fun and simple, making this block from 5-inch squares. Now I'm going to show you how simply it can be made using 2.5-inch strips. So for those of you who have many 2.5-inch strips in your life and you want to use them up, all it takes is a 13.5-inch piece of the light and the dark. I like to go ahead and cut both at the same time. I put these right sides together before I do my cutting. And for my cutting, what we need to cut then is the 4.5 inches for our rectangles, 2.5-inch cut for our smaller squares, and then using the easy angle ruler, cutting the triangles for the easy angle ruler for the half square triangles. All you have to do then is sew these guys together to create your half square triangle units. Once you have those sewn and you have your components for the pieces here, you're ready to lay those out and sew those together exactly how we put the block together when we were using the 5-inch squares. Another wonderful block, and it was so fast and easy to make using either the 5-inch squares or the 2.5-inch strips. Ordering information is coming up next for the books that this quilt appears in. Thank you for joining me today, and until I post my next video, have fun making your quilts. All the information for making the Dawn to Dusk quilt in 3 different sizes can be found in the books More Nickel Quilts and the Big Book of Nickel Quilts. These books, as well as all my other books and patterns, can be ordered from my website. I've included a link to my website below in the video description area. When you purchase a book from my website, you can receive a free pattern of your choice from any of my published patterns. Write the name of the pattern in the inscription area next to your book selection. 1 free pattern per book purchased. Yes, if you purchase more than 1 book, you may select a free pattern for each book purchased. Purchases from my website will help fund the creation and production of more nickel quilt videos for all to enjoy and learn from. Thank you.